Margaret Jacobson was born April 5th, 1944, first child of Abe and Verna Jacobson, who were Pentecostal missionaries in Barbados. As a child, Margaret loved nothing more than drawing with her pastels, listening to the radio with her brothers, writing in her diaries, playing the accordion and piano in church, and going to the beach. How did this child with such promise become one of Hamilton's longest surviving homeless women? How did she go from top student and Sunday school teacher to a destitute woman who slept in the alleyways and alcoves of this city? These are some of the questions I set out to answer when I wrote my book. Her name was Margaret, Life and Death on the Streets.
So hello and welcome. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by Denise Davy, a nationally recognized journalist and author of Her Name Was Margaret, Life and Death on the Streets. Denise worked at the Hamilton Spectator for 26 years, where she won numerous awards, including a National Newspaper Award. Denise's book explores the tragic life of a homeless woman and exposes the flawed plan that led to today's homelessness epidemic. Welcome, Denise, and thank you so much for taking the time to introduce us to Margaret and share her powerful and important story.
Thanks, Erica.
So Denise, can you tell us about Margaret? How did you meet her?
Yes, good starting point. So Margaret was a 49-year-old homeless woman who had been on the streets for almost 10 years when I met her. The way that I met her was that I was a social issues reporter at the Hamilton Spectator at the time. And I'd been writing a lot of stories on just statistics and studies on homelessness. And I asked my editor if I could actually just spend the night at a downtown shelter to really put a face to the issue. And so I picked one called the Wesley Center drop-in because it really sort of was a magnet for more chronically ill. And I knew that I'd get really the complete picture of just how difficult and challenging homelessness could be. So yeah, I headed down there one night on a freezing cold January, and it was around midnight when Margaret wandered in. And I still talk about, I interviewed a couple of people already, but I still talk about how when I looked across the room at her and saw this just tragically worn down woman with tattered clothes and malnourished, and the front photo on my book is actually the night I met her. I describe her as having like gray, leathery skin. She had horrible acne all her life, that cystic acne. So it had really left a lot of pock marks. And her hair was just this matted mess. And I just looked at her and thought, how could this happen to anyone in a country like Canada? That we could just be walking past this woman who it turned out was so well known. She earned the nickname Princess Margaret. And I've talked to so many people who've said, I knew Margaret. I used to go out of my way, once, twice a week and go down and give her $5 or buy her a coffee and that sort of thing. So the staff warned me not to talk to her because they said she could be violent. Actually, she had a habit of smashing people over the head with their melamine coffee mugs. And actually later on, I would meet her boyfriend, who leaned forward during the interview and showed me a white scar on his forehead and said, this is where she hit me. I felt like looking at her, she is not going to hurt me if I don't hurt her. And also she probably did that as a defense mechanism. I mean, this poor woman who diagnosed with a complex form of schizophrenia, living alone on the streets in this kind of environment, she was absolutely a target for assaults and sexual assault. So anyways, I wandered over to her bench where she was sitting, and I said, hi, Margaret, because they told me your name, and could I sit down? And she ignored me a few times and then finally just said, I don't care. And I sat down, and she completely opened up and told me her life story, and it took like 45 minutes. And I say in the book that my pen couldn't keep up. I was just scribbling everything down, that her parents were Pentecostal missionaries from Canada who had moved to the Caribbean to spread the word of the gospel. And she was the oldest of 4 children. There were 3 brothers that came after her. Her childhood was very rigidly scheduled around church services, and she taught Sunday school, and very, very high pressure to be this perfect role model of a family. So she felt pressure from all areas. And it was around the age of 14, 15 that she started hearing voices. She was found, cowering in a corner at school one day, crying, and started behaving very bizarrely with her brothers, and then her father, very sexually inappropriate behavior, especially for 2 missionary parents. And so they up and left when she was about 17 and moved to Cambridge area. And then unfortunately, the problems continued, and she still had all kinds of schizophrenic symptoms and that sort of thing. So she was first admitted to a psychiatric hospital at the age of 18. And that was the Ontario Hospital in the Homewood Hospital in Guelph for a few months, but her illness was too complex. And so they transferred her to Ontario Hospital, which became the Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital. And it was when I got access to her medical files that my story went from, maybe 20 inches feature in the spec to my book.
Yeah. And so how were you able to access her medical files?
So this was way back in the 90s, actually, when I met her. And so, and I'll tell you later, why that's still relevant today. But so I phoned the hospital and I asked, can I access her medical files? Because all the information that Margaret had told me, I didn't know whether it was accurate or not. What were her parents Pentecostal missionaries? Had she taught Sunday school? And so I phoned them, and they said if she signed a Freedom of Information form, that they would allow me full access to her files, which absolutely blew me away. I have to say that when I did meet her family, I talked to her parents. Her mom was still alive, living in a nursing home in Springfield, Illinois. Her brother still lives in Beijing, China. I had lots of email conversations with him. And then her nephews as well are in the States. They were in like 150% support of me accessing her files and also writing about her. Number one, because they didn't know what had happened to her after the age of 16, 17, when Margaret was admitted. A couple of years later, the whole family moved to the States. And so they actually used to talk in whispers about Margaret, and it was sort of like, was she an alcoholic? Did she have AIDS? Well, all they knew was that she was in a hospital. So I felt like ethically it was okay, and Margaret gave me permission as well and signed the form. So I'll just to give you a glimpse. This is the 800. These are 869 pages that absolutely took months and months and months. I mean, this is 9 years. I have all these tags on it to try to keep, but there's some of them that were, this is two years alone. Just all because she was discharged and readmitted so many times. And this again that one is 2 years, but they didn't come like this. They actually came all in just a mess of pages, and I had to coordinate everything. It took me months, and I had them bound it like that with UPS with different colors, just in my mind to try to keep organized. But that's when my whole story exploded, and ended up finding out that she had been caught in this revolving door of being pushed in and thrown back out, and pushed in and thrown, and then and I realized, well, that's how she came to be in such a tragic, horrific state. It was all the mental health system.
Mental health. So what part of her story did that tell you about the mental health system? So what door did that open?
And this is where I had this sort of, call it my penny drop moment, because I realized, and it literally was like a light bulb. I realized, oh my God, this is not just Margaret's story. This is like the story of tens of thousands of people. And because how many times have you heard people say, yeah, I don't remember homelessness being this bad, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And if it was often, the grizzly guys drinking scotch out of a paper bag and that sort of thing. And
That
and really,
stereotypical view. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, which people actually still have bought into. But it really was the whole. So the whole premise of deinstitutionalization was, and it came about because of the introduction of antipsychotic drugs that made it possible to control the symptoms, which was a good thing.
Yeah.
But they had this idea that now that they're able to control these symptoms, and not everybody responded positively to these drugs, but their thought was that, well, we'll just let them live in the community, and that is true, that people will heal, whether it's from mental or physical health problems, better in their home.
Absolutely.
And so the thought was, move them into the community and give them the similar supports there. So, the beds were just closed systematically and in pretty fast order. By the time deinstitutionalization ended, from sort of the mid 60s to into the 80s, 80% of beds in psychiatric hospitals were closed, 80%. So people like Margaret, and this is why getting this firsthand glimpse of her through her files was so fascinating. People like Margaret were moved from 24/7 care in the hospital, just surrounded by all kinds of nurses and 3 meals a day and somebody to give her medication, which was critical, to basically just throwing her into a rundown boarding home. And the operators knew nothing about mental illness. It's just shocking that this is allowed to happen. And the hospitals had almost no follow-up. So people like Margaret would be moved into these homes and just left to fend for themselves. And in very short order, she'd stop taking her medications, because they'd say to her, listen, we'll give you a bus ticket, make your way up to the hospital, which was on the mountain in Hamilton, once every 2 weeks or something. I'm sorry, like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that's not going to happen. So after a while, her mental illness would take over. She'd stop coming home at night to this boarding home, and she'd be living literally on the streets. I mean, one of the worst scenarios, and I was in tears reading these files at times, but one of the worst situations was she was found in a dumpster in an apartment building basement, and she was covered in feces and head lice and was eating the garbage in there. And they took her to back to the hospital, and she told the doctors she'd been living there on and off for 2 years. And so you would think that after 1 or 2 of these discharges where she was put out in the street, that they'd stop doing it. And in fact, the doctors would say, and there's lengthy reports saying it is absolutely crystal clear that this person cannot manage on her own, that she needs 24/7 care. And they said she should never be discharged. And the same doctor within 3 weeks would be saying, well, it's time to let her go. There's nothing more we can do for her here. And I thought that's how strong the whole this force field of, like, we just got to get everybody out. So it literally, I mean, our entire and only mental health system that existed in this country was completely dismantled, and it has never been repaired or rebuilt. And I say to people in the audience when I speak, we're not just talking about homeless people that have been affected, because children and people experiencing anxiety on it, like adults of all ages, the services are not there. There's massive wait lists, and it was never built up after the whole system was dismantled.
Yeah, and it's those that are trying to work it are so overworked that they can't keep up with the demand either. So the supports on both sides are a struggle, and it's
absolutely
very hard to see. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So there's just to keep in keep with time. So there's some, I don't want to even call them characters, because it's pivotal people within in Margaret's story. So I'll just go through the main people.
Yeah.
So what did you think of Scott?
Okay, so that's one of the first questions people ask when I give talks, because people hate them. And I know reading the book or reading through the files, I was yelling out loud in the room by myself and going, oh my God, because he would write in her file. So Scott was one of her social workers.
Yeah, if you can give the audience those that haven't read it.
And he was with her for, I think it was a year and a half. And it was the worst year of her entire life. I mean, you have to read the book to find out what happened, but it was just, the things that happened were horrific. And it was all because he had this tough love approach that he thought, so what if she's got complex form of schizophrenia? She still needs to be, treated like a child and punished when she comes for help. And there were times like in the middle of winter when she'd show up and say, I have nowhere to live. And he'd write in his files, Margaret manipulating the system again. And we know she can manage perfectly well on her own in the community, and to admit her again would only like spoil her. And you're just thinking, what proof is there of that? There's no housing for people like her. And so anyways, I thought that he represented a lot of people who treat the sort of people with a mental illness as if they're bad, as opposed to recognizing that it's the illness that makes them do things.
It's just it's more of troublesome on the system than it is to try and help the person. So
exactly,
labeled the loophole finders, and it's sad that's still happening very much in the
very
system.
sad. Yeah.
So another one would be Bob. What did you think? If you can give a background who Bob was.
So Bob, when I met her in that shelter that night at midnight, she told me she had this boyfriend, and I'm like, okay, I got to check into that. So, I mean, that wasn't in her files, but I interviewed a lot of the shelter workers around the city. And sure enough, her and Bob had been an item for a couple of years. He had a very, very mild form of schizophrenia and mild epilepsy, both of which were managed with medications. And but he was on disability pension and had his own place to live. And he worked part-time at the Wesley Center, sort of helping clean the toilets and mopping up after people and that sort of thing. And he was just a really sweet, mild-mannered guy. I actually did, I think, 7 or 8 visits to, he's now in a nursing home in downtown Hamilton. I did 7, 8 visits to his room there. And I said in the book, I saw some of his generosity sitting with him there, because he loved her. Like he was it was a very problematic relationship that eventually he had to kick her out, because by that time she'd been living on the street so long that she'd become primal. I mean, she would just squat and urinate on the couch and throw beer bottles across the room. And she was just, like he said in the book, it was impossible to live with her. But he showed her this level of kindness that she'd never experienced. And I think there was a certain love there. It was an unusual type, but I thought that was important to add him in, because there was just so many tragic things that happened to Margaret. At least she had some people who loved her and cared for her.
And it's important to highlight those bits of kindness as well, because it makes such a big difference, however small.
Exactly.
And I think it's definitely a testament to his care for her. That I don't want to say put up with a lot, but he did have to put up with a lot. He tried. He really, really tried. Which was a very heartwarming part of the book and part of her story, for sure. And so the last one would be Auntie Marion.
Yes, and that was also, I felt, an important story because of the kindness that she showed. And I think that her attitude towards Margaret was very representative of a lot of people. And the attitude was, with just some home cooked meals and a lot of TLC, I think I can turn this person around if I just love her enough. And that's not possible. And again, she needed the community supports. And where that failed, so she was an aunt living in Regina and had always worried about Margaret, and let the hospital allowed her to take Margaret home with her and took a train back to Regina. And 4 months later, the whole thing just fell apart, and Marion was absolutely devastated, and she had to send Margaret back. And Margaret was unbelievably devastated as well. But again, I felt it was important, because if she had had the supports, and also a medical doctor or something who would say to her, don't let her go off her medication, because Marion thought, she seems really jittery and unhappy on the meds, I'll just take them off. That didn't work. So if she just had the supports, but instead they released this woman who had very complex form of schizophrenia into the care of someone with absolutely zero medical training.
Yep.
and just thought, how's that going to work?
Yeah.
So
I'll love her better.
yeah, I'll love her back to health. And it just didn't happen. And both of them were really devastated by it. And like Marion described, when she told Margaret, she just started to cry and shake her head, and she had to put her on a bus or train and send her back to Hamilton. So, but I thought that was, each of those three stories and those people were characters in their own that I felt played an important part in Margaret's life, but they were also very representative of people and how they respond to someone with a mental illness as well.
For sure. And I think that that's very evident from reading it, was that you can take those characters and those stories and apply to a lot of what I've at least experienced with my work with homeless and at-risk youth. So I thought that was a very good choice from your end.
And you mentioned like the people that work with homeless people, like, I mean, they must have just like compassion fatigue, they call it, because excuse me, to just see that level of illness and see somebody sleeping on the streets, it's just, I mean, it has an impact on your psyche, because you just, you get mad at the world that this is happening, as well as a feeling of helplessness.
Exactly. And it's, I think you highlighted an important point when you said Margaret didn't know how to receive that love and that care. And that is definitely something that I have experienced, where it's not personal, is if you don't grow up knowing what love and care is, you don't know how to react to it.
Right.
And sometimes it becomes a defense mechanism, where you said at the beginning, where she would hit people, and it's not necessarily a violent outburst. It's, I'm protecting me because this is how I've always had to protect me.
Exactly.
And I think that's,
and I think her Dr. David Dawson, I quoted him in the book as saying that typically when someone's diagnosed with a mental illness, or symptoms start to show, is they're sort of an arrested development. Like if they're diagnosed at 14, 15, it's like their sort of development as a maturity stops there. And then with Margaret, she never had an opportunity to go and work on her own and live on her own or develop any life skills. So, she was really stuck at sort of 14. And you saw that stubbornness and stuff that in her, that was, again, no fault of her own. That's a very typical thing that happens to people.
But everyone tend to blame her because she should know better, right?
I mean, there was one quote in this files from a doctor towards the end, and he said, if Margaret doesn't shape up, she's going to have to ship out. And I thought, shape up or ship out? She's got schizophrenia. It's just shocking. And I'm not sure things have changed that much. I mean, we're not putting them in ward, like the new HPH is like separate units, apartments, and way fewer beds. But, there's still that attitude where you're misbehaving. So,
and it's, and knowing when I worked with youth that were at risk, it was, if they were released from the hospital, it was, I knew what they were going home to, but it was never, I shouldn't say never, but on the medical side and the support side, there wasn't time to absorb all of that. It's, we need the beds, we need you out. And then, I would step in and try to provide support where I could, because of the fact that I knew what they were going home or not home to.
Tough job.
It is a tough job.
It
changes you. It definitely changes you as a person. So I really, when I was reading your book, there was some moments where I thought, I know exactly what she's thinking right now. So I'd like to expand our discussion a little bit to homelessness, if that's okay. But this will pause here and just let everyone know that we do have your book in our catalog. So you can pick it up at a library or put it on hold. And I encourage everyone to do that, because it definitely sheds some light on things that people may not really understand just from reading the news or passing someone on the street. So I do encourage.
And that was my goal quickly, like I can say, is to humanize homelessness by putting a name and a face to it.
And I think that makes a big difference.
And that hopefully when people see someone on the street, they ask them their name, or they think about the fact that they're a human being who was someone's son or daughter.
Are they okay? Do they need anything? Can I grab you a coffee? Something simple like that.
Right.
makes a big difference.
Does make huge difference.
It's something that people are like, we have to do all this. Well, sometimes just buying someone an orange juice might
Exactly.
make them a day, because you don't know if they're diabetic, you don't know when they've had their last meal.
Yeah.
So something as simple as that. So,
Yeah. And then they feel so invisible too. So it's the gift of the, you know, the money or food that's helpful, but it's also telling them that you see them.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's
I've had
important.
someone say, thank you for treating me like a human. I'm like, well, you are a human.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
those are powerful words coming back at somebody. So
Definitely.
so to expand the conversation, what are the most common misconceptions about homeless people that
Oh,
you've experienced and you've seen?
wow.
I know there's a lot of stereotypes out there, but
Yeah.
um,
I have to say it's the most common because, and I've had this like face-to-face conversations with people. They say, "Oh, what's your book about?" And I'll tell them, and then they'll look at me and go, "Oh, that sounds like an amazing story." But I think that, you know, maybe half or so people are there by choice. And you just like, honestly, I can't tell you how many people said that. And I'm like,
Yep.
choice. Like, first off, it's like, this is an act of desperation. There is literally nowhere left to go. Like, do you really think people were setting up tent encampments because they wanted to go camping?
yep.
They
In the
were
middle of winter.
There was
Yeah.
nowhere else to go. I
Yeah.
mean, I did a column for the Toronto Star recently, and I said we have a one size fits all shelter system.
Yep.
That it's like, if you can't stand the bunk beds that are, you know, 3 feet apart or whatever, you just got to suck it up. And people complained about bed bugs, and people who have a pet, or if they're part of a couple and they really need to be with each other,
Yep.
then the shelter doesn't work for them. And
Nope.
it's not them saying, I've even had like mayors and city councilors say to me, how can anybody sleep outside rather than be in a shelter? And I said, well, that says something about our shelter system,
Yep.
that it's that bad. We need
Under
to
a bridge is more comfortable, then we need to have a
Yeah.
conversation. Yep.
That's why there's a proposal in Hamilton now for a tiny cabins, like the tiny houses.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just that they can have them built in a week and a half. They're just, and it's just
Yeah.
getting, you know, held up by things. But even that, to get them into something temporary and get them out of the cold, and now we're heading into the rainy season. And
Yeah.
so that's, I'd say, the number one.
Mhm.
And I don't know if this is a misconception, but certainly there's a huge lack of awareness of just how many illnesses. And even with my 20 years of research into this topic, I was really shocked at the level of like epilepsy, diabetes, level 4 cancers, of course, like sunstroke in the summer, frostbite in the winter, way more prone to being hit by a car,
Yep.
substance abuse, just to, you know, take them away from their horrific circumstances. And so I think there's a real lack of awareness around that. And I'd say one of the key things too is misconception that there's no solution to homelessness.
Yep.
And so I talk about Medicine Hat Alberta, that basically it's an ongoing thing with them, but they've basically solved it. I mean, they've got people in housing within, I think it's their goal is like within 3 days of someone arriving in a shelter, they put them in permanent housing.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
answer is, as
Yep.
long as it's got supports tailored to the individual needs of that person. And the last misconception I'll mention is that homelessness isn't costing us anything. And that was the studies I found across Canada, from Montreal, McGill University, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, all had done extensive studies anywhere in the area of 65,000 to 120,000 a year to keep someone on the street.
Yep.
And I mean, I met one person when I was doing a talk, and she's been caring for, it's a part of her job, caring for someone who has a mental illness. And they estimated that her cost of services, because she sometimes goes to emerge 7-8 times a day.
Oh, wow.
They estimated her cost of services in 18 months was $1.5 million.
Wow.
And so you'd think you'd look at that. Like when I
For
talked to
one
the mayor of
person.
Hamilton, I said, if you don't do it for humane reasons, do it for economic, because what Medicine Hat found is it's costing them about 24,000 to keep someone housed for a year. And they're actually found they're making an unexpected amount of money back, because people are paying their fines that they had. They weren't able to pay them before.
Yeah.
So
No,
that's a huge one that, you know, like I said, if we don't act for humane reasons, that like you just make changes, because really, I go back to the point of when I first met Margaret. It's just absolutely shocking to me that here we are in Canada, And we have this hugely vulnerable segment of our population sleeping on the streets in the cold.
Yep.
Just unbelievable. So
Yep.
those are the three I'd highlight, sort of the homelessness is a choice, there's no solution, and the illness component.
Yeah, I would add the assumption that if you've grown up in poverty, you've experienced homelessness, it kind of goes with your choices. You grew up with it, so you must experience it. Where I worked with youth that came from families of doctors, came from families of high administrators, and they were physically and emotionally abused at home. So they had no other place to go but the street.
Exactly.
And that always blew people away, because I'm like, nope, it doesn't. Or they'd come out to their parents and they disagree with their lifestyle choices, so they decide to leave home. They couch surf for a while, and then they end up on the street.
Exactly.
And
it's a slippery slope.
It's a very
once that happens.
Exactly.
They always say, who are the homeless? And I said, it's the foster teenager that's aged out of the system. Yep. It's the Indigenous fellow who's faced racism all his life. It's someone, somebody works at Good Shepherd Center told me about a woman who had 2 sons. She was married with a job. They ended up, marriage fell apart, and she wasn't getting support payments, and one of her sons got an ear infection. And she had to take the antibiotic dollars out of the rent money. Yeah. And then the second son got sick, and she couldn't go to work, lost her job. This all happened over about 2 years, but lost her job and then lost custody of her kids.
Wow.
Because they lost housing. And so that's just one story, and there's many complex different stories. But there's often the bond or the thread through them is mental illness.
Yeah.
It really is. Like they say 70% or so is some sort of mental illness, because, and again, how can we treat people like that who need so much help?
Yeah, and not being able to get that support, and making it so difficult to get that support.
Yes, exactly. And the problem is too, once they do get on the streets, there's a fellow in Hamilton that I've been taking food and clothing to since November, because this winter was so brutal. Mm-hmm. And once they're there, it's so much more difficult to get them off. Like Margaret, after 10 years, like I said, she would just stand there and just urinate on the street. And that's why Medicine Hat realized, like, we have to get them within 3 days of coming to a shelter, and go from there.
That's amazing. And it is highlighted on the story is on your website. So I would encourage people to go to your website as well.
Okay.
to check that out. I've read it and I thought, this is amazing. I was blown away by in the UK, they've taken mental health support workers and put them in barber shops. So they've trained them as barbers, so that when people are getting their hair cut and they're talking, they're being treated with their hair and mentally by support workers. I'm like, that is thinking so far outside the box. That's amazing. And if they identify, they're able to identify if somebody's in crisis or needs additional support.
I love it.
We did that with therapy dogs at the University of Windsor. We had mental health professionals at our pause rooms. It just, if there was any red flags, we had people jump in. So I think it's just more prevalent than I think people really give credit. It's not just a talking point. There is a lot of mental health out there that needs to be properly supported. So in saying that, as a librarian, how do you see, or how do you think libraries can be supportive and bring education awareness about our homeless community members?
Well, I'd have to say talks like this, that sort of thing, and certainly making books on homelessness accessible in the library. And then, just the fact that, like, I know in Hamilton, they basically are doubling as warming centers for homeless people. And that's what was so tragic during the pandemic when libraries were closed, is that people lost this huge support system they had. So I think that's a big one. You've been in both segments, so maybe you can speak more to that.
I'd say computer use is key for a lot of our members, having access to computers. I have a friend who works with the homeless population here in providing clothing support and bus passes and that sort of thing. And she would constantly reach out to say, how can people access computers? What's the process?
Right.
And again, warming centers when it was, having curbside service, but, we only could have 1 or 2 people inside the building at a time. And they get an hour, half hour on the computer. So the people would have to wait, and it
Oh,
didn't
that's what they
matter
did.
who you were, you still
Right.
had to wait because of restrictions in capacity numbers. So that was a challenge for a lot of us in trying to fit, making sure people were supported and had access. And we had a
Right.
lot of conversations about how to best support it, but it comes back to, you have to do what the city and the government is saying. These are our mandates. So
Right.
trying to
Right.
keep everyone safe,
Yeah.
and supportive where we can. So
Yeah.
I've always been a proponent that education awareness is key, and how we treat our community members who are experiencing homelessness, mental health, or addiction is key. You're
Definitely.
welcome. You're absolutely welcome to come inside.
Right.
And
Right.
making sure that people everybody feels safe and
Right.
welcomed. And if there's a support we can offer or a connection that we can make, we'll do our best to establish that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, why do they deserve any less than anybody and the rest of us?
Exactly.
It's really horrific. I always say to people when they ask, what can I do? I say, well, I know people that talk to the shelters will say, of course, volunteering, donating, helping hand, giving gift cards or money to people on the street is good, and don't stop. But we need you to contact your politicians and just say to them, you have to make changes. Like I won't vote for you unless you don't. And just because that's what it's all about, is the votes. And the homeless people don't vote normally, not as many of them. And so they're a forgotten population.
Yeah. And the not having a fixed address is obviously a barrier for quite a few things. So,
Right.
And that's people without addresses can come in as visitors to use our computers. So that wasn't,
good.
But we recognize that can be an issue as well. So, but yeah, I think that's education is key, and awareness is key, and your book is definitely a starting point for people. So
I have found that people are who aren't even interested in it, the topic, they'll pick it up to read about her.
Yes.
And that's what I was hoping for as well, was that, like I said, the human connection, because you're telling a story, and storytelling is compelling